I'm Deepak Kannal. I'm the ex-dean of the Faculty of Fine Arts, MS University of Baroda. I am a sculptor and an art historian, taught aesthetics and art history for more than 30 years. Today, I have been invited to conduct the first module of the paper Aesthetics and Philosophy in the PG program in Visual Arts. So, I was thinking of starting our first schedule with the general understanding of the very notion of aesthetics in the Indian tradition as well as in the Western traditions. Actually, there are at least three major aesthetic traditions in the world. There might be more. We do not know about Egyptian aesthetics. We do not know about Mesopotamian aesthetics. But it doesn't mean that they did not have a tradition in aesthetics. We do not know anything about it. But if we are talking about the traditions that are known to us, we will have to mainly focus on the Indian tradition, which is our own tradition, then the Western tradition, which is a very, very rich tradition, and the third tradition is Far Eastern tradition. Unfortunately, our understanding of the Far Eastern tradition is very cursory. So, in these sessions, in various modules, sometimes we might be referring to those ideas and those concepts, but it will not be possible for us to cover the Far Eastern tradition extensively. And that is why our discussion will mainly revolve around the Indian tradition as well as the Western tradition. So basically, we will have to understand what exactly is the difference between the understanding of these traditions in these two civilizations. Though we use the term aesthetics for both these traditions, I think we understand it differently. The Western tradition has understood it differently. The Indian tradition has understood it differently. In the Western tradition, aesthetics was always a part of philosophy. I don't know whether you are aware of the fact that the word aesthetics was introduced in 18th century. Today, we use it very commonly. But this word was not known before 18th century. Baumgarten is the first scholar to use this term for the philosophy of art. Before that, aesthetics was always considered as an offshoot of philosophy in the Western tradition. Most of the aesthetes in the Western traditions are basically philosophers. I'm sure you must have something about it, learned something about it. And most of the early aesthetes are Plato, Aristotle, Kant, Nietzsche. You have heard all these names, and they are basically philosophers. The first aesthete who claims to be an aesthete is Benedetto Croce. He says, I am not a philosopher, I am an aesthete. So that is in 19th century. Otherwise, in the Western tradition, aesthetics is always an extension of philosophy. And that is why in many times we call it philosophy of art. This is how this subject is recognized, philosophy of art. In the Indian tradition, it was always a part of grammar. Rather, sometimes it is jocularly, it is also called Vyakaranasya Puchha, which literally means the tail of grammar. It is a tail of grammar. It is an extension of grammar, because most of the aesthetic theories in the Indian traditions are discussed under the grammar, and it is not necessarily the grammar of literary arts. It can be a grammar of theatre. It can, that every art has its own grammar. You have a background of music, and you know that music has its own grammar. Dance has its own grammar. Literature has its own grammar, and similarly visual arts also have their own grammar. In India, the aesthetic theories revolve around the grammar. If you see the Western tradition, Plato does not talk about any particular art. Plato is a very important scholar. All of you have heard his name. And his theory of mimesis, his theory of imitation is known to everybody. But he is not talking about a particular art. He talks about art with a capital A. Art, not particular art. But if you come back to India, Bharata is talking about theatre. Abhinav Gupta is talking about theatre. Dandi is talking about literature. Or rather, in the later period, aesthetics in India is known as Sahitya Shastra, not Saundarya Shastra. Though it is considered to be the theory of beauty, in India it is not called Saundarya Shastra. Sometimes it is called Sahitya Shastra, sometimes it is called Natya Shastra. Bharata's treatise is not known as Saundarya Shastra. It is known as Natya Shastra. So in India, the tradition is strongly rooted in a particular art. We have separate aesthetics for theatre. We have separate aesthetics for dance. We have separate aesthetics for literature. We have separate aesthetics for music. So we have Natya Shastra, we have Nritya Shastra, even we have a great text like Chitrasutra of Vishnu Dharmottara, which speaks about the visual arts. This is the basic difference between the Western tradition and the Indian tradition. The Indian tradition of aesthetics is rooted in different arts, and that is why we have different aesthetics for different arts. On the other hand, the Western tradition is a little audacious. They are almost trying to propose a theory which is applicable to all the arts of all the times. So what Plato talks about art is not necessarily applicable to Greek art. He is not talking about Greek art. He is talking about art, which means that he is talking about the art which came into existence before Greek period and which is going to come into existence after the Greek period also. And not only the art of sculpture or painting, but all the arts which we know about. So the agenda of the Western aesthetics and the agenda of Indian aesthetics is basically different from each other. We must understand this. When I say it is an extension of philosophy, what exactly did I mean? What is philosophy? When we say philosophy, there is a philosophical inquiry. What is a philosophical inquiry? Have you heard about it? What is? Philosophy. What will you call philosophy? Normally, whenever we talk of philosophy, we talk about ये ब्रह्म सत्य है, ये जगन मिथ्या है, दुनिया फानी है. All these theories are considered to be philosophical theories. But there are three major inquiries in philosophies, and they are known as ontological inquiry, epistemological inquiry, and axiological inquiry. In Indian tradition, India also has a great tradition of philosophy, but it is separate, it is different than the tradition of aesthetics. In India, ontology is known as Satta Shastra, and Satta here does not mean power. Normally we use the term Satta for power. Satta means Sat. Sat is Astitva, existence. So the inquiry regarding the existence of something is Satta Shastra or ontology. Whether a thing really exists or not is the first inquiry. When we talk about God, most of the philosophical inquiries are about this world and the God. So whether God exists or not is an ontological inquiry about God. Whether this world is real or not, these are the inquiries. This is a philosophical inquiry. So there is an ontological inquiry which inquires into the existence of something. After inquiring into the existence of something or coming to some conclusion about the existence, we will have to go further to inquire into the nature of it. And to understand that, we will have to study it properly, we will have to gather the knowledge of that particular thing. This stage is known as epistemological inquiry. Episteme means knowledge. In Sanskrit, this inquiry is known as Jnana Shastra. Jnana Shastra. It is not only Jnana, it is Jnana Shastra. Epistemology, not only episteme, not only knowledge. It is theory of knowledge, epistemology. So that is another philosophical inquiry. The third philosophical inquiry now, after understanding about the existence and understanding about the nature, now we also want to know about the value. The value of it. Is it good or bad? That is also a very important inquiry. So that particular inquiry is known as axiological inquiry. Axiology. That is the third inquiry, which is, we can call it Mulyadharit inquiry. Mulya. Mulya is not कीमत नहीं. Mulya is not cost. Mulya is value. So axiology is the third philosophical inquiry. Now in Indian tradition in aesthetics, we do not come across this inquiry very often. But it does not mean that Indian aesthetics is totally free from it. In some of the discussions, you will find that these questions are raised by some of the scholars, particularly while offering a commentary on the existing theory. Some scholars have raised philosophical questions on that theory, but otherwise the theory starts with the technicalities of that particular art. As I said, the Western tradition inquires about the philosophy. The Indian tradition starts its inquiry with a very mundane thing. Like if you see Natya Shastra, in Natya Shastra is a huge compendium. I don't know whether you people have seen Natya Shastra or have read Natya Shastra. Natya Shastra has everything about theatre in it. It speaks about the theatre architecture, it speaks about the theatre language, it speaks about the making of the proscenium, making of the auditorium, the relationship between the proscenium and the auditorium, the texts, the acting, the makeup, everything, body gestures, intonations, dialogue delivery. So it speaks about the total technology of theatre. At the same time, it also talks about the concept of theatre. It also talks about the beauty of theatre, which is very interesting. Unlike the Western tradition, the Indian aesthetic tradition is working slightly differently. It is inquiring in a slightly different manner. So and that is why most of these texts, in some of the texts, Bharata's Natya Shastra inquires in both these areas. It speaks about the technology, it speaks about the concepts also. But there are so many medieval texts. I don't know whether you people have heard various names like Aparajita Pruchha, Samarangana Sutradhar, Manasollas. I don't know whether you have heard these names. These are 12th century texts, and which give you prescriptions for making art. That if you want to make a particular kind of picture, what are the things that you are expected to follow? Or you people must have heard about Shadanga, the 6 principles of art. Now these texts are only prescriptive texts. What is good art and what is bad art? So if you have all these qualities in a picture, then this is a good picture. If these qualities are not there, the picture is not a good picture. Now, do you think that evaluating a work of art is that easy and that simplistic? A work of art which is not good today may be considered good tomorrow, because the criteria always keeps changing. The criteria of value judgment is always ephemeral. It is always short-living. Van Gogh, when he started painting, was not considered to be a good painter, but later on today we consider him as a master, which means that the criteria which existed when Van Gogh was at work was not adequate to understand the mystery and intricacies of Van Gogh's paintings. It is not the painting that was at fault, it was the criteria that fell short to encompass the intricacies of Van Gogh's painting. So the criteria is always lagging behind the flight of the creator, which means that the criteria is always ephemeral. The criteria is always short-living. Today's criteria may not remain valid tomorrow. It will keep changing. That kind of writing, Indian tradition has taken note of it. It's very interesting. Indian tradition says that this kind of writing, which only speaks about the criteria, which tries to evaluate a work of art, should be treated as Lakshana Grantha. Have you heard this word Lakshan? बुखार के लक्षण है या तो मलेरिया के लक्षण है, कहते हैं ना हम लोग. लक्षण is symptom. These texts are symptomatic texts, and the symptoms are always temporary. They keep changing. So these Lakshana Granthas are not given the status of a Shastra Grantha. These Lakshana Granthas are important for a short while, and then after some time they will be redundant. But the Shastra Granthas try to inquire into the greater complexities. The Shastra Granthas try to inquire into the conceptual matters, and that is why the Shastra Grantha is considered to be more important, more with greater longevity, and that is why more with greater gravity. So Natya Shastra is a Shastra Grantha because it also delves into the concepts of theatre, not only the technology of theatre, not only the grammar of theatre. Do you understand the point? So there are Shastra Granthas and there are Lakshana Granthas. Only the Shastra Granthas are considered to be the works of aesthetics. So we could understand the basic difference that the Western tradition is an offshoot of philosophy which does not try to inquire into the technology of that particular art, and it tries to find a theory which is applicable to all the arts of all the time. On the other hand, the Indian tradition is rooted in a particular art, takes cognizance of the grammar of that particular art and tries to elevate to the concepts through the grammar. To put it in brief, we can say that the Indian aesthetic tradition is medium specific or material specific. On the other hand, the Western tradition is not material specific. It is free of any specific material. There is another very interesting difference between the Western tradition and the Indian tradition. The Western tradition has always treated art as a worldly activity. It is a skill. It is an achievement of an individual. Michelangelo is considered to be a great human being who had a capacity to create great art. Or Leonardo was always treated as a great intellectual. On the other hand, in the Indian tradition, the artist is almost being treated as somebody who has almost descended from the blues. In India, the art has been given an alaukika status. Alaukika means the one that does not belong to this world. What is art? Brahmananda Sahodara. It is similar to the pleasure of Brahma, which means that art is not being treated as an activity of this world. It is something otherworldly. It is heavenly, and probably that is why, unlike the Western tradition, in India we do not come across any theory regarding the origin of art. In the Western tradition, there are various theories regarding origin of art. They say that art is a product of surplus energy. When in prehistoric times, when the man did all his daily activities, he went for hunting, managed to get his food, had his food, cooked it, whether cooked it or had it raw. After doing all the course of the day, then if he has some more time and more energy left, then what would he do? Then perhaps he would dance, perhaps he would sing. That could be the beginning of art. So probably art was born from the surplus energy that man had. Or art is an expression of human emotions. Or art, so there are various theories which have been proposed by the Western aesthetic tradition. In India, if you see the texts like Natya Shastra or Vishnu Dharmottara Purana, you will come across some myths. In Natya Shastra, it is said that Bharata was really troubled by the sorrows and miseries of people who did not have access to knowledge, particularly the women and the people of the people from downtrodden classes, because they were not supposed to have knowledge. They did not have access to Vedic studies. So Bharata requested Lord Shankar, Lord Shiva, and then Lord Shiva gave him the Panchama Veda. Natya Shastra is considered to be the Pancham Veda, the fifth Veda. You know that there are 4 Vedas which impart knowledge to people. This is the 5th Veda which was imparted to Bharata, and then Bharata handed it over to hundreds of his sons, and those sons taught the art of theatre to people, which helped the common man to get over their miseries. दुखार्ता नाम, शोकार्ता नाम, जो दुख से ग्रसित है, शोक से ग्रसित है. For such people, this was a solace. Art was a solace for those people. Now, in Vishnu Dharmottara Purana, the story comes, the art of painting. While talking about the art of painting, Vishnu Dharmottara Purana tells us that Lord Vishnu once painted a picture of a beautiful woman on his thigh with amra rasa, with the juice of mango, and that figure came out to be so beautiful. That is the first drawing ever made. Now that was the first drawing, and Vishnu himself liked it so much that he brought that lady to life. That is Urvashi. Uru is thigh, and Urvashi is the one who was born out of the thigh. So that was the first instance of making a visual expression. And then from that expression, the art of painting came into existence, and then it was taught to Markandeya, Markandeya taught it to Vajra and to many other people. Why these myths? Why don't we try to search for the real possible origin of any art? The reason could be we want to maintain the alaukika status of art. We do not want to admit that art is a product of human intelligence. We do not want to accept that art has been created by mankind. We consider that art is created in the heavens and we are the people who have inherited it. This is the difference between the Western tradition, that in the Western tradition, art is a skillful activity but belongs to this world, barring a few moments like romanticism. But otherwise, in India, art has been always given an otherworldly status and alaukika status. The other basic difference which I always notice between the Indian tradition and the Western tradition is the growth of Indian tradition is rectilinear. Do you understand what is rectilinear? Rectilinear is developing in a single line. Developing in a single line. As against the Western tradition is not rectilinear. There could be different reasons for it, but before that we will try to understand why I want to conclude like this. If you see the history of Indian aesthetics, one of the earliest scholars that are known to us, we are going to discuss the history in details, and there are so many scholars who have contributed to the realm of aesthetics even before Bharata. But the first major compendium that we come across is Bharata's Natya Shastra, and that is why we start our discussion from Natya Shastra. So if you see Natya Shastra, most of the scholars who come after Bharata, they are trying to extend the thought which has been already put forward by Bharata. Whether it is theory of Riti, whether it is theory of Rasa, most of the scholars in 8th century, 9th century, 10th century, 11th century, they are either contesting Bharata's thought or they are supporting Bharata's thought. So, they do not keep aside Bharata's thought and put forward something different, altogether new. And that is why all through the history of Indian aesthetics, you will find Bharata's ideas being contested and supported through the ages. On the other hand, if you see the tradition of Western aesthetics, Plato comes up with the theory of mimesis, and his own pupil, Aristotle, contests that theory. He condemns that theory and proposes another theory. On one hand, he tries to give an argument against the theory of mimesis, and he also proposes his own theory. After a few years, there are two scholars, Horace and Longinus, who again support and contest that theory. But again, in 13th century, another scholar comes up with another theory, and this goes on. There are several new theories which are coming up in the Western tradition that doesn't happen in the Indian tradition. So on one hand, we could see the strength of Indian scholastic tradition, Indian aesthetic tradition, and on the other hand, we should notice also the weakness of the aesthetic tradition in India. The reasons could be many, but the reason which I can propose, or rather I can think of, is that in Indian scholastic tradition, Shabda Praman was given too much of an importance. Do you know what is Pramana? Pramana is evidence. And there are several different evidences that can be furnished in support of your argument. And as we think that Pratyaksha Pramana should be considered as the most important of them, most valid of them, because if you witness something on your own, if you have experienced it on your own, you can prove it that yes, this is what I have experienced, this is what I have seen, this is what I have witnessed. But that is not considered to be the most valid pramana in Indian tradition. The Shabda Pramana is the Shabda of the authority is considered to be the important, which means that if you have seen something on your own, if you have witnessed something on your own, and if your Guru tells that what you saw was not correct, you are supposed to believe your Guru and not your own experience. Probably that is the reason why we always tried to endorse the ideas of our forefathers. And the same thing can be seen in our scholastic tradition also. We seldom questioned our forefathers. we seldom challenged our forefathers, and that is why the development of Indian knowledges is always rectilinear. It goes in a line. This is another difference which you can observe between the Western tradition and the Indian tradition. So you can see that these two traditions are flourishing independently. They are coming up with these different ideas. Though the Western culture at that time had direct interaction with Indian culture. We know Greeks came to India with the Western world. We know so many people like so many places like Paitan or Nala Sopara or Ter, where we find Roman antiquities. And we also know that Indian people traded with the Western world. So the interaction was there, but we are not very sure whether there was any interaction between the scholastic worlds of the West and the East, because we do not see any parallelism between the two. But at the same time, you will observe that some of the ideas which flourished in the West in the prehistoric times may sprout in India sometime in the medieval period, or something which has been discussed in the West in 3rd century BC is being contested in India in 9th century AD, or whatever has been discussed in 2nd century BC in India is again being discussed in modern Europe. The best example would be the example of the linguistic theories, which are considered to be the most important aesthetic theories today. A great scholar like Bhartrhari has discussed something sometime in 3rd century BC. The time of Bhartrhari is not exactly known, but it could be 3rd century BC to 1st century BC. Whatever he has written in 3rd century BC is being discussed in the modern world, in the modern Western world today. The modern linguistics in Europe is talking about the same ideas which were discussed in India 2000 years back. Now, this could be just a coincidence. Sometimes you can trace some reasons behind it, but otherwise, these ideas perhaps surfaced in different periods by accident. You cannot see any direct correspondence between the two. There are some Far Eastern theories, like there is a theory called Shadanga in India, and a similar theory is found in China also, which is known as C.A. Ho's 6 principles, 6 limbs of art. Now, there is some similarity between the two, but I personally think that barring the number of those limbs, there is no much of a similarity between the theories. So, if you find this kind of parallelism, if you find the similarity between different theories, it could be just a coincidence, or the ideas must have sprouted at different junctures. Personally, do not find any specific reasons for that. So this is another difference between the Western tradition and the Indian tradition. Now the question remains that the theories which were discussed or which came into existence 2000 years ago, or perhaps more than that, why should we discuss them today? What exactly could be the relevance of it, whether it is in the Western tradition or in the Indian tradition? And I think what we discussed just a few minutes back has the answer of this question lies in that discussion. I tried to differentiate between the Shastra Granthas and the Lakshana Granthas, the theorization, the theories, and the symptomatic discussion. The symptomatic discussion, as we discussed, could be ephemeral and may not be very relevant in the next generation. It dies down in that very generation. And like today, if somebody starts painting like Ravi Verma, however beautifully he paints in that idiom, we are not going to consider that work as a great work of art. We know that. Or if Picasso would have born in 18th century or 17th century and would have started painting the way he painted in 20th century, probably people would have thought that he is mad. So you understand what I'm trying to say. So this symptomatic understanding is always ephemeral, is always short-living, but the theories have an intrinsic potential to be reborn. The theories can be reinterpreted. The theory is almost like a seed which can be preserved and can be sowed again. There is a theory called sublime. A scholar called Longinus, we do not even know we are going to discuss this particular theory at a later juncture in details. But this scholar, we are not very sure about the exact date of this scholar. Some people believe that he was born in 1st century. Some people believe that he was a 3rd century scholar. But he proposed a theory called, he was a rhetorist, not even aesthete. He was not a scholar or a philosopher. He was a rhetorist. Do you know what is a rhetorist? In Greece, the art of giving lectures was considered to be very important. In those days, the politicians were great speakers. Even today, some of the best politicians are best orators. Oratory is a very, very important ability in politics. And that is why in those days, in Greece, rhetorics was considered to be a great art. People were taught to speak effectively. And this scholar was a rhetorist, Longinus. And he proposed a theory of sublime. Sublime is an ability which transports people. If a person can move the listener, if a person can charge the listener, if the person can transport the listener, it is a great ability according to Longinus. And in those days, he was not considered to be a great scholar. In Romantic period, that theory, which was translated in Renaissance period, was rediscovered and it became one of the most important theories. And very surprisingly, the scholar who was not considered to be a very important scholar in his own days became one of the greatest scholars in 19th century. This is very interesting. What does that mean? It means that a theory has a potential to be reborn, to reflourish even at a later juncture. And that is why all these theories, they are very precious. We know there are movements like pre-Raphaelite movement. All the elements in Raphael's paintings were rediscovered and retried in 19th century. Or there is a philosophical movement which is known as Neoplatonic movement. They are trying to revalidate Plato. They are trying to re-understand Plato, and they are studying Plato once again in the new context. So as the context changes, the meaning of the theory also changes. You get my point? The theory cannot be understood without the reference of the time, without the context of the time. So in the different times, the theory can issue different possibilities. The theory can impart different possibilities. And that is why the theory need to be preserved and need to be understood and reinterpreted in the given context. Why do we study aesthetics? Because it is quite possible that some theory in 13th century, some theory in 2nd century, some theory in 3rd century BC might answer our problems today. What we are trying to, and that precisely has happened. Bhartrhari became a hot property in the Western scholastic world today. There are so many universities in the Western world which are offering full paper on Bhartrhari. The linguist, who is a Sanskrit linguist, we forgot him. But we realize that what he said in 2nd, 3rd century BC is not only relevant today, but perhaps it is some of the most exciting theories which he is talking about. So that is why we are expected to study all these theories, but the theory with its intrinsic flexibility. The theory is always flexible. It should not be taken with rigidity. No theory can surpass the common sense. You cannot keep aside your common sense and try to understand the theories. When you study aesthetics, you must keep this particular thing in mind. Today it is an introductory lecture, and that is why I am warning you of many of these things. That no theory is absolute. No theory should be taken rigidly. None of the theories is going to sort out all your problems. Being a student of art, if you try to find a solution of your problem in a particular theory, you will be mistaken. Plato is not going to answer your questions. Plato can guide you. Plato can point at the possibility. You will have to search your way. Many a times my students ask me that Plato says this and Aristotle says this. Who is correct? I said both of them are equally wrong and both of them are equally correct. There is nothing correct or wrong in aesthetics. There is something which is correct for you and could be wrong for her. And there is something which could be correct for her and wrong for you. You will have to find what is wrong and what is correct for you. Because every theory is partially true. Every theory is partially correct. No theory is absolutely correct. And there is a beautiful analogy which is given by one of the scholars while talking about aesthetics. He says studying aesthetics is like climbing a mountain. When you climb a mountain, have you climbed the mountain? You do not climb a mountain like you climb a staircase. You go around it. And at every juncture, you see a different view of the mountain. When you go further, at some juncture, the mountain looks ferocious. Then you go further and it looks very pleasant. So at every stage, the mountain looks different. Now, which of the view is correct? None of them is fully correct. But none of them is fully wrong. So no theory, no aesthetic theory is wrong. No aesthetic theory is fully correct. You will have to understand. So if you really want to experience the mountain, you will have to imagine all those views together, put them together, and that perhaps might give you the understanding of the mountain. Aesthetics and art is an activity which is similar to this. I sometimes also get tempted to bring in that popular analogy of the elephant and the six blind men. Each of them tried to understand the elephant differently. One of them felt that the elephant is like a rope. The other felt that the elephant is like a pole. The third one felt that it is like a large wall. But none of them was perfectly correct. Every one of them had a partial understanding of the elephant. So every theory is a partial understanding of the great reality called art. Art cannot be fathomed. Art cannot be understood totally. Nobody can whether it is Plato, whether it is Aristotle, whether it is Bharata. Nobody can understand art fully. It is Bharata's understanding, it is Plato's understanding, it is Aristotle's understanding of art. It need not be your understanding of art. But Plato and Aristotle will hold your finger and draw you to the realm of art, and then you will have to find your own way. So study all the aesthetic theories, but find yours to have your own understanding of art. We also must take cognizance of one of the greatest shortcomings in the Indian tradition of aesthetic scholarship. If you see the parallel development of these two traditions, which we have been trying to understand since last 35 minutes, you will see that the Western tradition gradually started flourishing more and more after 17th and 18th century. And after 19th and 20th century, there are so many theories and contra-theories. There is a big debate on aesthetic matters. There are so many other disciplines which are contributing to the aesthetic understanding of the Western mankind. On the other hand, if you see that after Jagannatha or Vishwanatha, there is hardly any major scholar who has contributed to the aesthetic thought. In 19th and 20th century, we do not have almost a single scholar who has contributed anything to aesthetic thinking. In 20th century, there are a couple of scholars, like Rabindranath has offered his views on art, or Aurobindo has offered his views. But barring these few scholars, India does not have any contribution to aesthetic thinking in the modern times, which is a very, very sad thing. And I think when we are trying to understand to juxtapose these two traditions, it becomes obligatory for us to take cognizance of this miserable fact. So we will talk about the comparison, the historical comparison. As I said earlier, in the next session, we will try to trace the evolution of aesthetic thinking in these two traditions and juxtapose them together to understand